Well, as we're getting into spring and the weather's starting to warm up, I don't know about you, but it's time for some of us that a lot of people start getting ready for spring and start getting ready for the season. For some, that may mean doing a whole lot of cleaning, and they call it spring cleaning for a reason. Or maybe it's getting your lawnmower tuned up, ready for the season. But for me as a fisherman, it's a great time because it's a time where I get to get all of my fishing equipment together for the season and get it prepared. I actually love that whole process. It's one of the things about fishing that I really love is getting all of my gear together and laying it all out and figuring it all out, making sure that I have everything I need in place to be ready for any scenario. In fact, if you ask Debbie, I have tubs of different fishing lures that I collect over the years and things like that. But it's going through things, and it includes I get my kayak and I rearrange the layout of my kayak so that I can reach everything really easy and get the most important things I need, putting new line on my fishing reels so that I have fresh line that won't break, or having the right fishing lures in the right boxes so that I can grab what I need easiest, because there is nothing worse than showing up at your favorite lake and you unload everything and realize you forgot half of your kayak paddle, or that you hear the fish are biting on a certain lure and you're out on the water and you realize you have that lure in a box in your car and it's doing you no good there. So it's important, and part of the challenge in fishing comes down to preparing well, taking the time to have all the pieces in place that are needed. Now, this truth, it just isn't important when it comes to fishing or maybe your favorite activity that you might have, but it also is very important when it comes to our walk with God. You see, as God accomplishes his plans in and through our lives, God isn't just in control of final outcomes in life. Do you know that? God is also preparing well, putting the right pieces in place to accomplish these outcomes. So God's not just in charge of the final things that happen, but all along the way, he's in charge of putting all those things in place to make sure those outcomes come to play. And this is what we find today as we return to our series and return to the Book of Esther this morning. So why don't you turn to the Book of Esther? It's, again, a great way to find it is to go to Psalms and then go back 2 books. And we're in Esther 2 this morning. And as we looked at last week, although the name of God is never mentioned in this Old Testament book, his presence is unmistakable in his control and his care for his people that are living far from home. And as this amazing drama unfolds, and we started to get into some of the drama last week, what we do is we find encouragement even for our own lives today. As God reveals himself as ever present and always working, even when we can't see him, and especially in the midst of crisis. You see, even when God seems to be nowhere, God tells us, I am now here. And that is the message or theme of Esther. In fact, in chapter 1 last week, when we went through the first chapter, we saw God setting the stage. We kind of talked about it. He's setting the table for his own feast because we looked at all these feasts. But it was basically, he's setting the stage for a new queen to be needed after this guy, Ahasuerus, who is the king of the vast and mighty Persian Empire, right? After Ahasuerus deposes his king or kicks his queen out named Vashti because she disrespects him in the midst of one of the parties he was having. And so now there's this absence of a queen in this greatest empire in the world at that time. And this is kind of where we pick up, or the scene where we pick up here. Again, the Jews there's still many Jews here in the Persian Empire that didn't go back to Jerusalem and Judea, and they are still kind of held captive and still there in this strange land. And here we are in chapter 2. So let's just start reading, and we'll take a break during reading and explain some of the things that we're seeing. So verse 1, it says, after these things, after the deposing of Vashti, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what he had done, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the capital, under the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. So here's what's happening. It's actually about 3 years after this party, after Vashti is deposed. And during this 3 years, this is when a lot of historians and things think that this was when Ahasuerus or Xerxes had his failed invasion of Greece. Remember, he was going to go back to Greece and finish his dad's business, and it failed. It utterly failed, this attack on Greece. So he's back now in Susa, in the capital, and he's very down, right? He's at a real low point, and he starts to think back when things were better. And he starts to think of Queen Vashti, and he's like, man, what did I do? He starts thinking clearly, like some of us are apt to do when we look back at things, right? And maybe he's having some regrets here. But as he starts to think back on Vashti, then some of his young advisors that are around him notice this, and they come up with an idea. They said, we know what will cheer you up. Why don't you get a new queen? But not only get a new queen, why don't you have a beauty contest of sorts, right? Where you can bring all these young girls from all over the Persian Empire, have them brought in to be with you. Basically, to come and sleep with him. And then, when all these women come in, they're going to be beautiful and you're going to be happy. And then, out of all these women, one of them you're going to really like, we imagine, and you can make her the queen. And it said, yeah, this pleased them very much. So he says, let's do that. So he sends out this law and this edict into the empire that they're going to have this basic beauty contest or this for the next queen. And it's into this that we're introduced to some people. It says in verse 5, now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as her own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in the custody of Hegai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. So here we're introduced to two more of the main characters, right? There's four main characters, basically, in this drama of Esther. We have the king, and now we have two more that we're introduced to, and they're both Jews. The first is this guy Mordecai, right? And he's kind of an older kind of guy, and he's a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin, which is in Judah, right? And it says his family was taken captive when the Babylonians had invaded some 70 plus years prior and had taken all these people away. Now, what we know from that is when Nebuchadnezzar came and took the Jews out of Judah in this invasion, he took the best and the brightest. So he took a lot of the aristocratic families, a lot of the families of note there. So we kind of get that idea from Mordecai. And what we also learn about Mordecai is that he probably has some position here in the citadel or in the palaces of Susa as a government official of some sort. And we kind of see this, first of all, because we know what kind of family he's from. Second of all, a little later, we're going to see that he can make his way around this palace without being stopped. He's kind of free to roam around, so he probably has some kind of position here. But anyway, Mordecai has a cousin. Her name's Esther. Okay, and she's a lot younger, and she's an orphan. So he takes her in and raises her like his daughter. And it says about Esther that she is a real stunner, right? I mean, she's gorgeous. It says, right, she has a beautiful figure and she's lovely to look at. Now, Esther's probably about 14, 15 years old here, looking at the culture of the day and things like that. So, anyway, when the king's order goes out to look for all these beautiful young virgins, it says that she was taken into the king's palace. Now, the idea of being taken into the king's palace, even though it's not explicitly said, it kind of takes the idea she might not have had any choice in this. They might have just saw her or heard about her beauty, and they said, come on, you're part of this. So she's taken into the palace and participating in this quote-unquote wife search, okay? Now, when she gets there, our passage kind of continues. It says that she finds favor in the eyes of Hegai. Okay, so Hegai's kind of over. He's kind of the guy prepping all these women to meet the king. And he's taken with Esther. Probably not just her beauty, but there's more than that. And what he does is it says he makes sure she has all the food she needs, so the best food and the best cosmetics. He assigns to her 7 handmaidens to make sure she has everything she needs. And it says she puts her in the best place, best location here in the palace in this harem of all these virgin women. So she's set up in the best possible position to meet this king. Now again, Esther's a Jew. I don't think there's other Jews necessarily being taken in here. And Mordecai had told her before she was taken, don't tell anybody you're a Jew right now. Don't, just go with this, right? So she doesn't tell anybody. And Mordecai is kind of watching out for Esther. In fact, he continues to watch out for Esther because we see in verse 11, it says, every day while Esther's there in this harem, Mordecai walked in front of the court. See, he's kind of walking around. He walks in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. So he's free to roam around. I don't think they'd let the general public in to walk around this harem, and to look in on this harem. This was a pretty big deal. So, but Mordecai's there looking out for Esther through this. Anyway, passage then explains how this whole competition thing is going to work, or how it's set up, that the king is going to meet these young virgins and choose his bride. It basically says what's going to happen is these women are going to be prepared to meet this king. For 12 months, they're going to be prepared or beautified. It says for 6 months, they're going to be given treatments of the oil myrrh, which is like a fragrant oil. So for 6 months, they're going to get that rubbed on, and they're just to beautify them. And then for 6 months, they're going to have spices and other ointments that they're going to be treated with. So they're basically prepping these women so they can be at their absolute best and most beautiful and most appealing to meet this king. So, and also there was a side benefit. If it was a year, that's how they would know somebody really was a virgin, because they wouldn't be pregnant, So they would say, well, that's enough time to go by that we'll know they're okay. Anyway, at the end of the 12 months, then the girls would be called in one at a time to spend a night with the king. And again, spend the night with the king is what you may be thinking, in his bed. So each night, a different girl would be brought in to spend a night with the king, and then in the morning, she would be taken out, and she would be placed in a different harem. It says a second harem. This harem, because they're no longer virgin, is what it's implying. So they'll be put in the second harem, and she basically had to wait there. She was consigned to wait there until or if the king was really pleased with her and he summons her back by name. And if he doesn't summon her back, then basically the girl's kind of consigned to spend the rest of her life essentially living as an unloved woman because she can never marry again. So she's just a part of this palace harem or as a concubine. So it's not a great outlook for most of these women. And what it says is that when the women could go in to be with the king, they could bring one item with them. It's kind of like, it's kind of like you can bring one kind of comfort item, like Survivor or something. I don't know. But they can bring one item with them that they desire, I guess to make them feel more comfortable or something like this. Well, Esther's turn finally comes, and instead of her bringing an item she desires, she goes to Hegai and says, what would you advise me to bring? So she's kind of showing that she gets that, he's a key guy here. And she kind of comes up to him and asks him that. In fact, this is a real key to this whole passage and this whole story of Esther. It's at the end of verse 15. Look at the end of verse 15. It says, now Esther, through all this, was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So everybody she meets, she's impressing, and they're just taken with her. Not just with her beauty, but again, more than that. Okay, she has humility and she has grace and all of these things going for her. Anyway, verse 16, it kind of continues what happens. And when Esther was taken in to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace, it was the 10th month of the 7th year of his reign. So it's 479 BC, and it's somewhere around December-ish is where this month is. Anyway, verse 17, it says, when she was brought in, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. She won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so much so that he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Isn't this amazing? So he meets Esther, spends the night with her, and is so taken by her, he's like, it's over. I'm in love. And it says he falls in love with her, and he makes her his queen. Now, there's a couple questions you may have right now, and we're not really told the answer, but we can kind of surmise some of the answers. First of all, Esther's a Jew, and we know that the Jewish people back in the Old Testament, they were told by God, don't marry anybody who's not a Jew, right? God was pretty explicit with saying that. Well, here it seems that Esther is marrying somebody who's not a Jew. Isn't that a sin? Even worse than that, did Esther then have sex with this guy before marriage? Because we know that's a sin. We know that's forbidden by God. And how is this happening? Well, we're not told on either account, where this lies, whether it happened, but we're not told it didn't happen. We can kind of surmise it probably did. She probably did have sex with him because that was what was expected of her, and all the other women did, and it didn't say she didn't. So we can kind of surmise this. But we need to remember something very important with Esther. God isn't saying, well, this is okay now. We have to understand the purpose of Esther. And the book of Esther, it's not trying to prop up Esther or any of the other characters mentioned in the book as some moral model to follow. Okay? And we're not propping Esther up to say, oh, her faithfulness, be like Esther. Nowhere in Esther does it say, no, we're to be like Esther in this sense. Rather, the purpose of the book of Esther is to put forth God's faithfulness and to promote God's faithfulness to his people in the midst of a dark and sinful world, even in their own failures as a people. So even despite their sin, God is still faithful. So that's really what's happening in Esther. So we can't really get hung up on some of those things. It was a messy world, and people were falling into sin, and they weren't necessarily saying, oh, I'm just so holy, and, it's not necessarily like that. But God is still using it and working despite that. Anyway, so back to the story. The king is smitten with Esther, right? So smitten and so in love, he says, I'm going to have a feast. That didn't go well the last time he did that, right? But he has a feast, and he invites all his officials and everything, and it's the feast for Esther, basically to introduce Esther to everybody and all of this, right? And we know that that the king is so excited about this because he puts a pause on all the taxes. It says he remits taxes. He says, you know what, I am so happy. You don't have to pay your taxes for the next couple months or whatever he did with it. And he also gave generous gifts to people throughout the empire. So all of a sudden, he's like a different guy. He's not the guy all sullen and sad. He's just like, this is the greatest thing that ever happened. And this is great, but this isn't the whole story of what's going on. Because as the story continues, a little bit later, we find Mordecai. And Mordecai is still kind of hanging around. And one day, he finds himself, he's sitting by the king's gate. So he's sitting in the palace by the king's gate, and he's just hanging out, I guess, doing his business. When, lo and behold, he overhears something. He overhears two of the king's guards, two of the king's eunuchs, and he overhears them talking, and they're angry. They're angry at the king, and they're plotting, they're making a plot to kill the king. And they said, man, we got to get him, so here's how we're going to do it. And they're trying to make this plan. And lo and behold, Mordecai happens to overhear this. So after he overhears it, he says, man, I got to tell somebody. So he goes and he tells Esther, hey, you know, these two guys are trying to kill the king. They're Bigthan and Teresh were their names. And he says, these guys are plotting to kill the king. And he tells Esther, and Esther tells the king. And he says, you know, my cousin Mordecai overheard this, and he told me, and I want you to know this. And it says they investigated. It's verse 23, the last verse says, when the affair was investigated and found to be so they investigated, and they found out, yeah, this was true. They were going to kill him. And so these two men were hanged on the gallows. They were executed. And then it closes and says, and the whole thing was recorded in the book of the Chronicles, or the log book for the empire, in the presence of the king. So the king made sure all of this was written down. That this plot, and Mordecai was the guy who kind of fleshed it out. Okay? So, pretty amazing, huh? A lot going on here. Again, Esther's full of drama. I mean, think of everything we have. We have beauty pageants. We have new characters introduced. We have adult time in the palace. You know, we have a new queen. We have a plot to kill the king discovered and fleshed out, you know, rooted out. And all on the surface, all of this drama, it seems pretty random, doesn't it? It's like, man, there's a lot going on. Thank goodness all this is kind of working out. Wow. But it's far from random. You see, without Esther being the queen, the king would have been killed. But more significant than that, there's more to come. There's a more important role for Esther to play, that she had to be put in place here. You see, what we have here in chapter 2 is God, a picture of God, moving pieces around like he's on a chessboard. And he's putting pieces into position, preparing for the main act of this drama to come, which is the salvation of his people, the Jews. So while all these events, they may seem like a coincidence, they're actually under the divine control of God. Isn't that awesome? And just as God prepares Esther and Mordecai for his saving work of the Jewish nation, do you know God still works the same way in our lives today? God prepares us and prepares events around us for our world. In fact, when we look a little closer at what's happening in this drama, there's an encouragement here of God working. In fact, what we discover is that how God prepares us for his work of bringing salvation to our world, for being a witness of him in our world. And the first way that we see this is in the way that God creates us, or the way that we're created. It's no accident. God makes us with purpose and on purpose exactly as he desires. We see this with Esther, right? She's a Jew because God purposed that. It's no accident. She's beautiful. That's no accident. She's one of the most beautiful people anybody's ever seen. That was no accident. That was all part of God's plan. And in the same way, we have the heritage that we have, you know? We look the way we look. We have the personality we have. We even have the gender that we have. Because God has made us like that. He's made us with and on purpose. His purpose. You got that? This is what God has done in creating us. In fact, the same kind of holds true for us. The psalmist says this. He says, "For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well." God has knitted us together. So do you think God is just randomly knitting us together? We're not a random collection of cells. That's not us. God is putting us together exactly as he wants us to be. In the New Testament, Paul says it like this. He says, "For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." That's right after he talks about we're saved by faith, not by works. Then he says, because we're his workmanship. You know the idea with that? We are his works of art. Imagine this. Imagine God, he's tucked away in a studio somewhere, and you kind of peek through the door, and all you see is his back, but you can see him frantically working on something, and he's scraping things away, and he's shaping and molding. And you know what he's molding? His masterpiece into something completely original and priceless. You know what it is? It's me. It's you. We are God's masterpieces, his works of art. And he designs and makes us with unique qualities, with unique talents, and with unique skills. Again, we're not just this bunch of cells thrown together and hope things turn out. Rather, we're thoughtful, inspired, well-designed creation of a loving, purposeful God. He makes us unique to accomplish his mission, which is sharing Jesus wherever we go. And he makes us just as he intends us to be for that purpose. Isn't that cool? Well, God not only reminds Esther and shows that he made Esther, created Esther with great purpose and for a purpose, but he also prepares her and prepares us another way. It seems that everywhere Esther went, we see this word that she found favor with people, right? Found favor with others who then stepped in to help her, to accept her, to help her learn, to help her grow. You see, God also prepares us for his work of bringing salvation to our world in the way that we're developed. So not only are we created with purpose, but God develops us with purpose. Esther's favor with others led to her growth. From Mordecai taking her in as his daughter so he can raise her to understand his heritage and have those values and things. To this guard, Hegai, who takes her in to make sure she's positioned the best she could be and to tell her, hey, here's how you're going to make the best of your time here. To even the king, who saves her from having a life of shame and being tossed into this second harem and tossed off. Esther had many people that were part of her journey of growth to bring God's salvation to her people. And in the same way, God brings people into our lives. He brings people into our lives that can have an impact. And that's no accident. They help protect us. They look out for us. They help us grow in our relationship with him. God prepares us for others. You know, Paul in Thessalonians says this, therefore, encourage one another and build one another up, just as you are doing. We ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you, who are over you in the Lord, and admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Be at peace amongst yourselves. He's basically saying, you know what? Be thankful and cherish those that God brings into our lives to deposit his wisdom and his care in us. Because when God does that, he's preparing us to live more confidently in and for him. So it's no accident that God brings us into a place where we can grow. And we should cherish that. And then finally, we see how God prepared, or how God laid this groundwork for all these lives that would be saved through this story of Esther. You know, all these lives that were to come, saved lives that were to come. And it begins here with the king's own life, right? Because right at the end, we see that it's saved through God's servants. First, you know, Mordecai just so happens to be at the exact right place, the king's gate, at the exact right time to happen to overhear two guys talking about a plot for the king. Do you really think that's a coincidence? No way. And of course, all of that information that Mordecai hears might go nowhere if it weren't for her cousin Esther, who just so happens to have the ear of the king as his new queen. Of course, that has to just be a coincidence, right? No way, right? This is God preparing the way for his salvation. And in the same way, God does this for us. He prepares us in the way that we're positioned in life by God. God places us in the position. It's no accident that we live in the country that we live in, that we have the parents that we have, that we work where we are, that we have the neighbors we have. That's no accident. These are far from random occurrences. Rather, God places us right where we are at the time and place he has planned for us to accomplish what he has for us. That should be pretty encouraging, isn't it? That what we're going through isn't random. Maybe it's at your job and you're sitting there going, well, it's just a job. No, God has you there for a purpose. Maybe it's because you're going to meet a coworker that needs to know about the hope that's only found in Jesus. And you're there at just the right time and place. Oh, I happen to know about this hope. Or maybe it's that you have a neighbor who's going through a health crisis that maybe you're familiar with, that you can walk with them through. You know, we just had a neighbor of ours, and he's talking to me and was telling me about how he's in a hospital, and I was praying for him and things. And he goes, "Yeah, they just told me I have cancer." And I'm like, "Oh no!" And I said, "Well, did they say what kind?" And he says, "Yeah, multiple myeloma, which is the exact cancer my dad has." And I'm just like, "Really?" And all of a sudden, we were able to talk that much more about it. And kind of look at what's ahead and be able to pray for him. That was no accident. You know, or maybe you're going through struggles in your life right now, but others around you are watching you go through these, and you can better relate to others because of that. Again, it's no accident. God's positioning us. God even positions us in places to grow, and in our church and amongst other believers. You know, Paul says, "But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them, as he chose. God positions us within a body of believers on purpose, for a purpose, for us to take a place there. That's why we want everybody here at Joy to be involved, because God has a unique spot that only you can fill. A unique contribution for you to make here. That's what Paul's saying. And because God positions us where we can grow in him and serve him best. That's our God. You see, God doesn't just control the final outcomes, the final outcome of events in our lives. He's over every part of his plans. And if we can't see it here, then we pretty much can't see it anywhere, right? I mean, we see here in Esther too that he moves pieces in place to accomplish his will, but all the way he's preparing for his work of bringing salvation. And he does this with us today. He prepares us to follow him, to bring salvation to our world in the way that he creates us, in the way he uniquely makes each and every one of us, in the way he develops us by giving us people who are going to help grow us and brings them into our lives, and the way he positions us, he places us right where we need to be for who, what, and where he wants us. God has placed us here with purpose. It's no accident. So that's our encouragement from Esther chapter 2, is that there aren't any accidents with God. And he's working, and he has a plan. And even though we may be going through things, and we say, where's God in all this? You know where God is? He's moving the pieces around saying, I'm putting you exactly where I want you to be, and you'll see it. Just keep going. Keep trusting. And that's our encouragement this morning. Things get even more dramatic next week in chapter 3, if that's possible. But again, this is Esther for us. All right, well, let's pray.